The wealthiest people in the room thought the black waiter standing before them had nothing worth respecting. To billionaire Cassandra Bell, Malcolm Reed was just another middle-aged server carrying wine trays and living paycheck to paycheck. But the moment she mocked his 11-year-old daughter, Malcolm calmly set the bottle down and whispered, "Mock me one more time." Then his sleeve slipped back, revealing a burn scar Cassandra recognized instantly. In one terrifying flash, she was no longer looking at a waiter. She was looking at the man who had once led her through smoke, fire, and chaos when everyone else believed they were going to die. She had spent years forgetting his name. Tonight, she was about to discover that the man she had humiliated was the very reason she had lived long enough to build her empire, and that the greatest debt of her life could no longer stay buried. The ballroom at Lakeshore Crown glowed beneath warm chandeliers, every crystal reflecting gold across polished marble floors. Soft jazz drifted through the room while servers moved quietly between tables dressed in white linen and silver candlelight. It was the kind of evening where every smile had been rehearsed, every handshake measured, and every conversation carried the weight of millions of dollars. Malcolm Reed balanced a tray of wine glasses with the same steady hands he'd trusted for years. He greeted each guest with calm professionalism, never rushing, never lingering. Around him, expensive watches flashed beneath tailored sleeves, and laughter rose easily from people who had never worried about the price of tomorrow. "Waiter." The single word cut through the room before Malcolm reached the head table. Cassandra Bell didn't bother looking up from the conversation she was having with two investors. "Red. Not the one you're holding. The other vintage." Malcolm offered a polite nod. "Of course, Ms. Bell." He exchanged the bottle without comment. Cassandra finally looked at him, her eyes sweeping over his pressed white shirt, black vest, and neatly polished shoes. "You seem a little old to still be carrying trays." A few people around the table laughed quietly. Malcolm uncorked the bottle with practiced ease. "I enjoy taking good care of people." She smiled, though there wasn't a trace of warmth in it. "I'm sure that's what everyone says when life doesn't go according to plan." Another ripple of uncomfortable laughter circled the table. One investor cleared his throat and looked toward his water glass instead of meeting Malcolm's eyes. Malcolm poured the wine without spilling a single drop. "Anything else this evening?" Cassandra leaned back. "Actually, yes." She studied him as though he were another decoration in the ballroom. "How many years have you been doing this?" "Long enough to know every guest deserves respect." "That's a careful answer." Her guests chuckled again. "And how many years would it take before a waiter could afford shoes like mine?" She crossed one leg over the other, letting the designer heels catch the light. "This pair cost more than most people spend on rent." The laughter grew slightly louder. Malcolm simply adjusted the bottle on the serving cloth. "They're very nice shoes." "They should be." She lifted her glass. "They represent success." For a brief second, Malcolm said nothing. Then he replied quietly, "I hope they take you somewhere worthwhile." The table fell silent. It wasn't disrespectful. It wasn't sarcastic. It was simply honest. Cassandra's smile tightened. "You have quite a bit of confidence for someone wearing an apron." "I've learned confidence doesn't come from clothing." Someone shifted awkwardly in a chair. Rachel Klein, Cassandra's executive assistant, glanced toward Malcolm with visible discomfort before lowering her eyes to the event schedule beside her plate. Cassandra wasn't finished. Her gaze landed on Malcolm's name badge. Behind the clear plastic sleeve was a tiny photograph of a smiling young girl with dark curls and bright eyes. "Your daughter?" Malcolm nodded once. "Her name is Nia." "How old?" 11. Cassandra tilted her head. "Does she tell her friends her father serves dinner at charity galas?" The room became very still. No one answered. "Or," Cassandra continued, almost gently, "does she pretend you do something else?" A fork stopped halfway to someone's mouth. "I wonder if she's embarrassed." Malcolm's fingers tightened around the neck of the wine bottle. Only slightly. "So many children want their parents to be successful." She looked directly at the picture. "I imagine that must be difficult for her." For the first time that evening, Malcolm didn't reach for another glass. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. slowly. He lowered the wine bottle onto the white tablecloth. The soft sound of glass touching linen echoed through the silence. Every conversation in the immediate area faded. Malcolm met Cassandra's eyes. His voice remained calm, low, controlled. "Mock me one more time." No one moved. No one even reached for a drink. Cassandra gave a small laugh. "Is that supposed to intimidate me?" Malcolm didn't blink. "Mock me one more time." As he rested both hands beside the bottle, the cuff of his sleeve slipped back just enough to reveal an old burn scar curving across his wrist. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. Cassandra's expression changed. The amusement disappeared. Her eyes locked onto the scar. For several long seconds, she simply stared. Then her gaze lifted to Malcolm's face. Something distant returned to her memory. Not the ballroom, not the investors. Smoke. Heat. A staircase filled with frightened voices, and one calm command cutting through the darkness. Her lips parted before she seemed aware she was speaking. "You were at Easton Tower." Every person at the table looked from Cassandra to Malcolm. Malcolm said nothing. He only watched her. The room, moments earlier filled with laughter, had become impossibly quiet. And for the first time that night, the billionaire looked at the waiter as though she were seeing him for the very first time. No one at the table spoke. A violin continued somewhere across the ballroom, but even the music seemed strangely distant. Malcolm held Cassandra's gaze for one quiet moment before lowering his sleeve over the old scar. "I'm sorry," Cassandra said, almost under her breath, as if the words had escaped without permission. Malcolm offered no answer. He simply picked up the wine bottle again and stepped away from the table, leaving behind a silence that none of the investors seemed eager to break. Rachel Klein watched him disappear into the crowd. She had worked beside Cassandra for nearly 8 years and had seen her negotiate billion-dollar deals without showing the slightest hesitation. Yet she had never seen that expression before. It looked disturbingly close to fear. Only a few hours earlier, the evening had begun very differently. Morning sunlight spilled through the small kitchen window of Malcolm's apartment on Chicago's South Side, painting warm squares across a worn wooden table that had survived 3 apartments and countless family dinners. Nia sat cross-legged on a chair, carefully threading bright yellow embroidery floss between her fingers. "Hold still," she said. Malcolm laughed. "I'm trying." "No, you're wiggling." She frowned with exaggerated seriousness before tightening the final knot around the leather band of his old wristwatch. "There." He turned his wrist. The yellow cord was simple, faded in places with 3 tiny knots tied carefully along its length. "Perfect," he said. Nia smiled proudly. "Mom always said things stay together better when they're tied with love." Malcolm's smile softened. "I remember." For a second, neither of them spoke. The apartment became quiet, except for the distant rumble of an elevated train and the old refrigerator humming in the corner. On the kitchen counter sat an unopened envelope from the hearing clinic. Malcolm had already read it once before Nia woke up. The cost of her therapy sessions would increase again next month. Insurance would cover only part of it. He quietly turned the envelope face down. Nia noticed anyway. "Is it more bills?" "Nothing we can't handle." "You always say that." "Because it's usually true." She studied his face longer than most 11-year-olds would have. "You don't have to smile every time something's hard, Dad." His heart tightened. Sometimes she sounded far older than her years. He reached over and brushed a loose curl away from her forehead. "I promised your mom we'd keep moving forward. And promises count." "They always count." Nia looked back at the yellow cord. 3 knots. She touched each one with a fingertip. "One for Mom." She touched the second. "One for you." Then the third. "And one for me." Malcolm nodded. "The team's still together." She grinned. "No one gets left behind." The words lingered between them. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, simply part of who they had become. A timer chimed from the stove. Malcolm packed Nia's lunch while she slipped her math homework into a faded blue backpack decorated with tiny music notes. Before leaving for school, she wrapped both arms around him. "Don't stay too late tonight." "I'll try." "You always try." "And I usually lose that argument." She laughed. But tomorrow's Saturday. I know. You promised pancakes. I never break pancake promises. She pointed a playful finger at him. You'd better not. After she left, Malcolm stood alone in the quiet apartment. His smile slowly faded. He picked up the clinic letter again. Then his rent notice. Then the schedule from Lakeshore Crown offering extra weekend shifts. He folded all 3 papers neatly together and slipped them into a kitchen drawer. Outside, another train rolled past. Inside, Malcolm fastened his old watch around his wrist. The 3 yellow knots rested against his skin. He ran his thumb gently across them before picking up his jacket. Whatever happened tonight, he needed that extra shift. He needed every dollar. And more than anything else, he needed Nia to keep believing that her father could always find a way. By late afternoon, Malcolm stepped through the employee entrance of Lakeshore Crown, where the scent of fresh bread mixed with polished wood and industrial detergent. The ballroom upstairs was still being prepared, but the kitchen already pulsed with quiet urgency. Cooks checked sauces, pastry chefs arranged desserts, and servers hurried between stainless steel counters with practiced efficiency. Evening, Malcolm, called Luis Mendoza from the dish station. The young dishwasher flexed his right wrist with a wince as another stack of plates rattled into the sink. You overdid it again? Malcolm asked. Luis gave an embarrassed grin. My brace came loose. Come here. Malcolm set down his apron and knelt beside him. With careful fingers, he adjusted the worn wrist brace, tightening one strap and loosening another. There. Luis rotated his hand. That already feels better. You keep lifting with your back and twisting your wrist, Malcolm said. You'll only make it worse. Luis laughed. You missed your calling. Malcolm smiled faintly. Maybe. He never explained further. Across the kitchen, banquet manager Elliot Crane noticed the conversation. Reed, he called sharply. Clock in first, play doctor later. Yes, sir. Malcolm simply nodded and walked away. No resentment, no argument, only quiet discipline. As he crossed the service corridor toward the ballroom, habit guided his eyes more than curiosity ever could. He glanced at the emergency exit beside the east hallway. Its fire door hesitated for a second before sealing shut, almost too slowly. Malcolm paused. He opened it halfway, released it. Again the door drifted closed instead of snapping firmly into place. His brow tightened almost imperceptibly. Nearby, another waiter pushed a dessert cart directly across part of the exit. Without saying a word, Malcolm rolled it several feet away. What are you doing? The waiter asked. If people ever need this door, Malcolm replied gently, they shouldn't have to move furniture first. The younger man shrugged. No one's ever used that exit. I hope they never have to. He continued walking. Inside the ballroom, decorators adjusted floral arrangements while electricians tested stage lighting for Cassandra Bell's presentation. Everything looked flawless. Almost. Malcolm's attention shifted upward. A ventilation fan above the eastern ceiling emitted a faint vibration that didn't quite match the others. Barely noticeable, but different. He listened for another few seconds before moving on. Rachel Klein entered, carrying a leather portfolio filled with presentation notes. She nearly collided with Malcolm as they rounded opposite sides of a column. Oh, I'm sorry. No harm done. She glanced toward the fire door Malcolm had been examining. Everything okay? I think maintenance may want to check that closer. Rachel looked at the door. It seems fine. It probably is. He smiled politely. I just noticed things. Before she could ask another question, Elliot appeared again. Malcolm. Yes? I've heard from 3 different people already. He folded his arms. You're moving carts, checking doors, reorganizing seating. I'm only trying to keep pathways clear. I hired servers. His tone hardened. Not inspectors. Several nearby employees fell silent. Elliot lowered his voice. Tonight is the biggest event we've hosted all year. Billionaires, city officials, board members. They expect perfection. So do I. Then focus on your tables. Malcolm nodded without protest. I will. As Elliot walked away, Luis quietly leaned toward him. You always see things nobody else notices. Malcolm fastened the last button on his cuff. covering the old scar completely. My old job trained me to. Louise frowned. I still don't know what your old job actually was. Malcolm hesitated just long enough for the question to hang in the air. Then he smiled. It doesn't matter anymore. A few moments later, guests began arriving beneath the hotel's grand entrance. Luxury sedans lined the curb. Camera flashes reflected against polished glass. Inside the ballroom, servers straightened their jackets. Musicians lifted their instruments. The evening officially began. As Malcolm took his position near the head table, his eyes drifted one last time toward the eastern fire door. It closed, slowly, just a fraction slower than it should have. He couldn't explain why, but the uneasy feeling refused to leave him. The ballroom slowly transformed from a beautiful room into a carefully choreographed performance. Staff members made their final adjustments, while photographers checked camera angles beneath a towering banner that read, Bell Renewal Building, Safer Communities for Tomorrow. The slogan hung above the stage in polished silver letters, reflecting softly against the crystal chandeliers. Guests began filling every table. City council members, developers, charity directors, bank executives. A handful of local reporters quietly compared notes before the program officially began. Every seat represented influence. Every conversation carried money. Malcolm moved between tables with practiced grace, topping off water glasses before anyone had to ask. He remembered names, preferred drinks, food allergies, small details most people overlooked. That was one reason Lakeshore Crown kept requesting him for their biggest events. Near the stage, Cassandra Bell stood beside a scale model of the Bell Renewal Development, greeting donors with effortless confidence. She looked completely different from the woman Malcolm had unsettled only moments earlier. If anyone had noticed the brief crack in her composure, it had disappeared behind years of boardroom discipline. Rachel Klein approached with a leather folder tucked beneath one arm. The board confirmed attendance, she said quietly. They're all here? Every member. And my father? Rachel glanced toward the private lounge overlooking the ballroom. He's resting upstairs. His doctor wants him to stay off his feet until your speech. Cassandra nodded. He'll come down when it's time. Rachel hesitated. About the waiter. Cassandra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of her tailored jacket. What about him? You seemed to recognize him. I recognized a scar. Rachel waited. Nothing more came. The launch is what matters tonight, Cassandra finally said. Nothing distracts from it. Rachel gave a small nod, though something about Cassandra's voice felt unusually restrained. Across the ballroom, Malcolm carefully repositioned another chair that slightly narrowed the aisle leading toward the eastern hallway. One of the decorators noticed. You really think anyone will care if it's 6 inches off? Malcolm smiled politely. If people ever need to move quickly. He stopped himself. It's better not to give them obstacles. The decorator shrugged. You worry too much. Maybe. Elliot Crane appeared again, clipboard tucked beneath his arm. Read. Malcolm turned. I've already told you once. We're ready for service. Then let's focus on service. His eyes followed Malcolm toward the repositioned chair. You don't work for the fire marshal. No. You work for me. I understand. Elliot lowered his voice. Tonight isn't just another banquet. He glanced toward Cassandra, greeting a circle of investors. Bell Renewal is expected to renovate more than 2,000 affordable housing units across the city. If this announcement goes well, thousands of families benefit. He paused. So don't create problems where there aren't any. Malcolm nodded respectfully. I never intend to. Elliot walked away, convinced the conversation had ended. But Malcolm's eyes drifted upward again. The eastern ventilation grill vibrated for barely half a second, then stopped. A strange rhythm. Not loud enough for anyone else to notice, just enough for someone who had spent years listening to buildings. Nearby, Louise carried a rack of polished glasses toward the ballroom entrance. You okay? He whispered. You've looked distracted all evening. Malcolm forced an easy smile. I'm fine. You sure? I'm sure. Louise accepted the answer, though he clearly didn't believe it. The first course was served. Conversations grew louder. Wine flowed freely. Laughter returned to the room. From the stage, Cassandra welcomed everyone with polished confidence. My family has always believed buildings should do more than shape skylines. She smiled warmly. They should protect the people inside them. Applause filled the ballroom. Malcolm paused only long enough to hear those words before continuing toward the head table with another bottle of wine, for reasons he couldn't explain. That sentence stayed with him longer than the applause, because somewhere deep inside his memory, he had once believed those exact words too, and tonight, standing beneath the glittering lights of Lakeshore Crown, he couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was trying to tell him something no one else was willing to hear. The applause slowly faded as dinner service settled into its rhythm. Servers glided between tables, carrying filet mignon, roasted vegetables, and polished silver trays. Crystal glasses chimed softly whenever guests toasted another successful partnership or another promising investment. Malcolm reached the service hallway behind the ballroom and paused. There it was again. A faint smell. Not smoke. Not yet. He closed his eyes for a second. Warm plastic. Electrical insulation. Just enough to catch his attention. He looked toward the ceiling where a small indicator light above the fire alarm panel blinked once, then disappeared. No audible warning, no flashing strobes. Just one lonely pulse. Luis emerged from the kitchen carrying a crate of clean glasses. "You smell that?" Malcolm asked quietly. Luis stopped. "Maybe somebody burned bread?" Malcolm shook his head. "No." He walked several steps farther down the corridor until he reached the electrical storage room. The door remained shut. Everything looked perfectly normal. Too normal? He rested the back of his fingers lightly against the metal door. Slightly warmer than it should have been. Not dangerous. Just wrong. Elliot Crane rounded the corner before Malcolm could think any further. "What now?" "I think maintenance should check this room." Elliot sighed heavily. "They already inspected everything this afternoon. I'd still like someone to take another look. And tell Cassandra Bell we're delaying dinner because one waiter has a feeling." Malcolm remained calm. "I'm asking for 5 minutes." "I'm saying no." Elliot pointed toward the ballroom. "Table 7 needs another bottle of Cabernet." Malcolm didn't argue. He simply nodded. "I understand." As he walked away, he quietly reached over and switched off 2 portable warming cabinets that weren't being used. One of the kitchen staff looked up. "Those are empty." "I know. Why'd you shut them off?" "They don't need to be drawing power." The cook shrugged. "Suit yourself." Malcolm picked up another wine bottle before noticing Luis rubbing his eyes. "You okay?" "My throat feels weird." Luis coughed once. "It'll pass." Malcolm frowned. "Step outside for a minute." "I can't. Elliot already thinks I'm too slow." "I'll cover your station." Luis hesitated. "You sure?" "Go get some fresh air." Without waiting for thanks, Malcolm slipped behind the dish station long enough to finish stacking the remaining trays. A busser walked past, pushing an extra dessert cart. Malcolm stopped him gently. "Can you park this over there instead?" He pointed away from the east exit. "Why?" "It blocks the hallway." "But nobody uses that door." "I know." The young man shrugged and moved it anyway. None of it seemed important by itself. A warming cabinet. One cough. One cart. One warm door. One blinking light. Tiny pieces. Pieces that refused to fit comfortably together. Back inside the ballroom, Cassandra continued greeting donors. She smiled for photographs, accepted congratulations, shook hands. No one watching would have guessed that only minutes earlier she had whispered the name of a building she hadn't spoken aloud in years. Rachel stepped beside her again. "The mayor's arriving in 5 minutes." "Good. And the foundation board wants a private toast afterward." "Fine." Rachel hesitated. "The waiter..." Cassandra's smile remained fixed for the cameras. "What about him?" "He keeps checking the hallways." "So I've noticed." "Should security be concerned?" Cassandra looked across the ballroom. Malcolm was quietly helping an elderly woman adjust her chair, so her walker rested within easy reach. Nothing dramatic, nothing attention-seeking, just a small kindness no photographer bothered to capture. "No," Cassandra answered at last. "I don't think security is the problem." Before Rachel could ask what she meant, every chandelier in the ballroom flickered. Just once. Almost too quickly for anyone to notice. Conversation continued. Music never stopped. Most guests assumed it was nothing, but Malcolm looked up immediately. His eyes narrowed toward the eastern ceiling. A second later, the small fire indicator near the hallway blinked once again, and this time, he was certain he hadn't imagined it. Malcolm set the wine bottle onto a nearby service station and walked quickly toward the east corridor. The faint smell of heated plastic had grown stronger, not enough to alarm an ordinary guest, enough to trouble someone who had spent years learning that buildings often whispered before they screamed. He reached the electrical room again and placed the back of his hand against the metal door. Warmer, definitely warmer. Luis stepped out from the kitchen, coughing into his elbow. "It still smells funny," he admitted. Malcolm looked at him. "When did the coughing start?" "A few minutes ago." "Go outside, get some fresh air." "I can't leave during service." "You can, if I'm telling you to." Luis hesitated only a second before nodding. As he disappeared toward the employee exit, Malcolm scanned the ballroom. Near the eastern aisle sat the elderly woman with the walker he had helped earlier. Beside her was another older couple, moving carefully between their chairs, smiling as they spoke with friends. If anything happened, that section would become the hardest place to evacuate. He turned and headed straight for Elliot Crane. The banquet manager was discussing dessert timing with the kitchen supervisor when Malcolm interrupted. "Elliot." "What now?" "I need maintenance here immediately." Elliot closed his clipboard with visible irritation. "We've already had this conversation." "The electrical room is getting warmer." "You measured it?" "No." "You saw smoke?" "Not yet." "You heard an alarm?" "No." Elliot exhaled sharply. "Then you're asking me to interrupt the biggest event of the year because of a feeling." "I'm asking because I've seen small warnings become big emergencies." Elliot folded his arms. "And I'm telling you to get back on the floor." Malcolm didn't move. "Elliot." "No." The answer came harder this time. "You are a waiter. You are not engineering. You are not security. And you are certainly not making decisions for this hotel." Several nearby servers stopped working just long enough to glance toward them. Malcolm lowered his voice. "If I'm wrong, we lose 5 minutes." "And if you're wrong after pulling an alarm?" Elliot stepped closer. "We lose this event. We lose future contracts. We lose jobs." The words hung between them. Malcolm understood every one of them. He needed this job himself. Naya's therapy bill sat folded inside the kitchen drawer at home. One suspension, one missed paycheck, one angry client. Any of it could make next month's payments impossible. He looked across the ballroom again. The elderly woman laughed softly as another guest poured her coffee. Nothing looked dangerous. Everything looked normal. That was exactly what unsettled him. Then his eyes stopped on something else. The east fire door. It didn't fully latch. It rested open by less than an inch before drifting shut. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. He had seen that combination before. Warm electrical equipment, delayed fire door, odd ventilation. Tiny warnings that meant nothing, until they meant everything. Without another word, Malcolm walked toward the manual fire alarm mounted beside the hallway. Elliot followed immediately. "What are you doing?" Malcolm stopped in front of the red pull station. "I'm making sure people get home tonight. You touch that and you're finished here." "I know." "You'll be suspended before the guests even reach the parking lot." "I understand." Elliot grabbed Malcolm's forearm. "Don't." The sudden movement caught Malcolm's watch. The yellow cord Nia had tied that morning snagged against the corner of a stainless steel service cart. A quiet snap. The thread broke. 3 tiny knots dropped onto the polished marble floor. For one suspended second, Malcolm simply stared at them. One for Danielle. One for himself. One for Nia. Scattered. His throat tightened. He remembered Nia's smile that morning. 3 knots. No one gets left behind. Slowly, Malcolm bent down and picked up the loose thread. He slipped it carefully into his vest pocket instead of throwing it away. Then he looked back at the crowded ballroom, at the elderly guests, at Luis, now coughing outside through the glass employee door, at families who had come believing they were safe. He closed his hand around the fire alarm lever. Elliot's voice rose. "Malcolm, don't." Malcolm answered without looking away from the crowded room. I'd rather explain a false alarm than apologize for waiting too long. His fingers tightened around the handle. And for the first time that evening, he made a choice that could cost him everything. Malcolm pulled the red alarm handle. A sharp metallic click echoed through the hallway. One heartbeat later, the hotel's fire alarm roared to life. The elegant music stopped mid-note. Conversation shattered into confusion. Red strobes flashed across crystal chandeliers, washing the ballroom in pulses of crimson light. For a brief moment, no one moved. Then Elliot Crane spun around, his face drained of color. "What have you done?" Guests looked from one another to the ceiling, uncertain whether this was a malfunction or a real emergency. Several laughed nervously. One investor reached for his phone. Another complained that someone had ruined the presentation. From the stage, Cassandra Bell instinctively stepped toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, forcing calm into her voice, "please remain where you are while hotel staff verify the situation." Malcolm's head snapped toward her. "No." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every instinct he had spent years building screamed the same warning. People who waited got trapped. He turned to the nearest group of servers. "Open the west corridor." They stared at him. Now. His certainty broke through their hesitation. Two servers hurried toward the emergency doors. Elliot grabbed Malcolm's shoulder. "I told you to stay out of this." Malcolm gently pulled free. "People need to move." "There isn't even smoke." Before Malcolm could answer, the ballroom lights flickered again. This time, the interruption lasted longer. A few guests gasped. Some finally rose from their chairs. Near the eastern hallway, the elderly woman with the walker struggled to stand while the crowd began pressing toward the main entrance all at once. "Please," she whispered. "I can't move that fast." Malcolm crossed the room immediately. "Ma'am." He knelt beside her. "We're going another way." He motioned toward two nearby servers. "You." Both young men looked startled. "Help her." Without waiting for permission, Malcolm folded the woman's walker and handed it to one server while the other supported her arm. Slow steps. Stay together. No rushing. Across the ballroom, panic continued growing. People naturally pushed toward the doors they had entered through. The western exits remained nearly empty. Malcolm climbed one step onto the edge of the stage. His voice carried through the room without shouting. "Everyone," heads turned. "Please place one hand on the shoulder of the person in front of you." His tone stayed steady. "Move together. Don't run. Use the west hallway." Someone asked, "Who are you?" Malcolm answered without hesitation. "A man trying to get you home safely." For reasons none of them could explain. People listened. The crowd began separating into smaller groups. Movement slowed. Order replaced chaos. Then, from somewhere behind the eastern service wall, a muffled pop echoed through the building. The lights dimmed again. This time, a faint ribbon of gray smoke slipped beneath the electrical room door. Luis, who had stepped outside minutes earlier, saw it first through the service entrance window. His eyes widened. "Malcolm!" Several kitchen employees turned simultaneously. Now everyone could smell it. Burning insulation. Rachel Klein stared toward the hallway in disbelief. He was right. Elliot looked frozen. He had spent the last several minutes trying to stop the one man who had correctly recognized the danger. Near the center of the ballroom, Cassandra watched Malcolm guiding frightened guests with calm precision. His words, his posture, the quiet authority. The way he never raised his voice, something buried deep inside her memory, finally surfaced. Not a ballroom. Not chandeliers, smoke, darkness, concrete stairs. A man's steady hand guiding strangers through blinding air. "Hand on the shoulder in front of you." The exact same words. "No one gets left behind on my stairs." Her breathing caught. She wasn't remembering a story. She was remembering the night someone had carried her through one of the worst moments of her life. And suddenly, she knew exactly why that scar had haunted her the instant she saw it. The memory didn't return all at once. It came in fragments. The sting of smoke in her eyes, concrete dust drifting through emergency lights, a calm voice cutting through panic. "Keep moving. Stay together. No one gets left behind." 6 years earlier, Cassandra had been a vice president visiting Easton Tower before its grand opening. She remembered becoming separated from the rest of her team when a sudden electrical fire filled one of the upper corridors with smoke. She remembered freezing halfway down a stairwell, unable to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, a man had appeared through the haze. His jacket had been scorched. One sleeve had caught fire before he beat it out against the concrete wall. He had taken command without ever raising his voice. He guided construction workers, office staff, and frightened visitors down the stairs in small groups, refusing to leave until everyone behind him had been accounted for. She had never learned his name. She had only remembered the burn across his wrist. Back in the present, Cassandra stared at Malcolm as firefighters rushed through the east corridor carrying thermal cameras and breathing equipment. One firefighter emerged from the electrical room moments later. "Small electrical fire," he called to the hotel manager. It was contained before it spread, but another 10 or 15 minutes, and this could have reached the cable chase. The words struck Elliot Crane like a physical blow. He slowly looked toward Malcolm. The waiter he had threatened with suspension had likely prevented a far more dangerous situation. Guests continued filing calmly toward the west exit, exactly as Malcolm had directed. No one was pushing. No one was trapped. The elderly woman with the walker squeezed Malcolm's hand before being escorted outside. "Thank you," she whispered. "You stayed with me." Malcolm gave her a gentle smile. "That's what we're supposed to do." Nearby, Rachel watched everything in stunned silence. She had expected panic. Instead, she had witnessed quiet leadership. Not once had Malcolm tried to prove he was right. His entire focus had remained on protecting strangers. Cassandra finally stepped toward him. "Your name." He looked at her. "You never asked for it earlier." A shadow of shame crossed her face. "No, I didn't." She took a slow breath. "Malcolm." The name felt unfamiliar on her tongue because she should have spoken it hours ago. "Were you the safety engineer at Easton Tower?" Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched firefighters wheel damaged electrical components into the hallway. "The building gave warnings," he said quietly. "Most people just didn't know how to listen." Cassandra felt her heartbeat quicken. "I remember someone carrying a little girl down one flight of stairs." Malcolm nodded once. "She'd been separated from her father." "You found them again." "I did." "You saved dozens of people." "I helped." The simplicity of the answer unsettled Cassandra more than any dramatic speech could have. "You disappeared afterward." "I went back to work." She frowned. "I searched for the engineer who led the evacuation." Malcolm's eyes drifted toward the damaged electrical room. "My report disappeared first." Cassandra looked confused. "What report?" "The original investigation." His voice remained steady. "I documented why the smoke spread the way it did." He paused. "The report carried my name." Rachel looked sharply toward him. "And then?" Malcolm met Cassandra's eyes. "It came back a week later." "My findings were still there." "My name wasn't." Silence settled between them. Cassandra searched his face, hoping to find anger. Instead, she found something far more difficult to face: disappointment. Not only in what had happened years ago, but in what she herself had become tonight. Before she could ask another question, one of the firefighters approached. "We've identified a ventilation issue that accelerated the smoke movement." He looked between the hotel manager and Cassandra. "It'll need a full engineering review." Malcolm closed his eyes for the briefest moment. The same pattern, the same mistake, the same warning. And somewhere deep inside, a realization settled over him with quiet certainty. Easton Tower hadn't been the end of the story. It had only been the beginning. The first fire engines had barely finished securing the electrical room when another hotel employee came running from the private executive wing. "Ms. Bell!" His voice cracked with panic. "Your father—" Cassandra turned instantly. "What happened?" "Mr. Bell is still upstairs." For a second, the entire hallway froze. "The elevator shut down after the alarm," the employee explained. "His wheelchair lost power, and the smoke doors sealed behind the private lounge." Cassandra's face drained of color. "My father can't walk." She rushed toward the east corridor, but a firefighter stepped into her path. "Ma'am, you can't go in there." "My father is in there." "We're assessing the safest route." "I don't have time to wait." She tried to move past him again. Malcolm stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Cassandra." She looked at him, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "He's alone." "I know. He'll think we abandoned him." "You didn't." His voice remained remarkably calm despite the growing activity around them. "He just needs someone to reach him safely." A firefighter approached with a spare smoke hood. "We're sending a team." Malcolm looked toward the emergency floor plan mounted beside the wall. His eyes followed the ventilation shafts, the service hallway, and the emergency stairwell. "The east stairwell is feeding smoke." The firefighter nodded. "It is. But the maintenance corridor behind the banquet kitchen connects to the private lounge." The firefighter looked surprised. "How do you know that?" "I've walked this building all week." He pointed toward a narrow service passage. "If the fire doors closed properly, that corridor should still be clear." The firefighter studied the map for only a moment before nodding. "He's right." Cassandra stared at Malcolm. "You'd go back in?" He met her eyes. "I'd go in for anyone." Without another word, he accepted the smoke hood from the firefighter. Before placing it over his head, he handed another one to Cassandra. "You stay here." "I'm coming." "No." "My father." "Your guests need you." She shook her head. "I don't care about the guests." "You will in 5 minutes." He looked toward the frightened crowd gathering outside the hotel. "They're watching you. They'll follow whatever example you set." Cassandra's breathing trembled. "I can't just stand here." "No. You can help organize the evacuation." He gently placed the smoke hood into her hands. "Keep families together. Make sure nobody gets pushed aside." She lowered her eyes. Those words sounded painfully familiar. Not because she had heard them 6 years ago, because she had failed to live by them only an hour earlier. The firefighter signaled his team. "We're moving." Malcolm adjusted the hood and followed them into the dim service corridor. The heavy fire door closed behind him with a solid metallic thud. Outside, Cassandra stood motionless. Rachel quietly stepped beside her. "What do we do?" Cassandra looked toward the frightened guests gathered beneath flashing emergency lights. An elderly couple stood uncertainly near the curb. One little boy cried because he couldn't find his grandmother. A hotel employee was trying unsuccessfully to calm everyone at once. For the first time that evening, Cassandra stopped thinking like a billionaire. She started walking toward the people who needed help. "You heard Malcolm?" she said quietly. "Keep families together." Rachel nodded. Together they began guiding guests toward the assembly area. No cameras, no speeches, no applause, only people helping people. Inside the building, Malcolm and 2 firefighters moved carefully through the maintenance corridor. The air was hazy but still passable. Then they reached the private lounge. Arthur Bell sat exactly where the employee had described. His powerless wheelchair faced the window. He looked relieved the moment he saw them. "I was beginning to think everyone forgot an old man." Malcolm smiled gently. "Not tonight." Arthur studied his face for a long second. "I know you." Malcolm didn't answer. The old man looked down at the scar on Malcolm's wrist. His expression slowly changed, not into surprise, into recognition. And unlike Cassandra, Arthur Bell seemed to understand far more than he was willing to say. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The muffled voices of firefighters echoed through the hallway while emergency lights washed the private lounge in slow pulses of red. Arthur looked at Malcolm's face as though he had expected this meeting for years. "You came back," the old man said quietly. "I came because someone needed help." Malcolm unlocked the wheelchair brakes while one firefighter checked Arthur's oxygen level. "We need to leave now." Arthur didn't move immediately. Instead, his eyes drifted to the scar on Malcolm's wrist. "I remember what happened after Easton Tower." Malcolm finally met his gaze. "I remember it too." Arthur lowered his head. "They took your report. They took more than the report." The old man's breathing grew heavier. "I know." The admission hung in the room with surprising weight. One firefighter interrupted gently. "Sir, we really need to move." Arthur nodded. As they guided the wheelchair into the maintenance corridor, he spoke again, his voice barely louder than the wheels rolling across the concrete floor. "I should have stopped it." Malcolm said nothing. Outside, the night air carried the smell of rain and wet pavement as paramedics checked guests one by one. Cassandra stood beside Rachel, helping elderly residents into warming buses that had arrived from the city. She had taken off her expensive heels without realizing it. Her bare feet rested on the cold sidewalk as she held the hand of a frightened little boy until his grandmother found him. No cameras followed her. No reporters asked questions. She simply stayed where she was needed. When the firefighters finally emerged with Arthur, Cassandra ran toward them. "Dad!" She knelt beside the wheelchair. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine." His tired eyes shifted toward Malcolm. He made sure of that. Relief washed over Cassandra's face. "Thank you." Malcolm only nodded. Before another word could be spoken, a black luxury SUV pulled into the emergency lane. A middle-aged attorney stepped out carrying a leather briefcase despite the flashing lights surrounding the hotel. He introduced himself quietly. "Daniel Foster, General Counsel for Bell Urban Holdings." Rachel frowned. "Now?" Arthur closed his eyes. "I asked him to come." The attorney looked first at Arthur, then at Cassandra, before finally stopping at Malcolm. "Mr. Reed, I understand there are unresolved matters connected to Easton Tower." Malcolm's expression remained unreadable. "There are." Daniel opened his briefcase just enough to reveal several folders. "My client would like to resolve those matters privately." Cassandra looked confused. "What are you talking about?" Arthur answered before the attorney could. "The original investigation." Cassandra stared at her father. "What investigation?" "The one you were never allowed to see." Silence settled over the group. Arthur looked years older than he had only minutes before. "The report Malcolm wrote after the fire." Cassandra's heartbeat quickened. "I thought the official report blamed faulty subcontractor wiring." Arthur slowly shook his head. "That wasn't the first report." Rachel looked from one face to another, suddenly realizing the story reached far beyond a single hotel incident. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, Bell Urban Holdings is prepared to offer a confidential settlement. A generous one, including financial compensation, consulting opportunities, and complete coverage for your daughter's future medical expenses." The words landed like stones. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. For the first time all night, Nia entered his thoughts instead of the hotel, the clinic bills, the rising cost of therapy, the tiny apartment, Saturday pancakes, 3 yellow knots now resting loose inside his vest pocket, everything a father wanted to protect. Daniel continued carefully. "In return," he hesitated, "we ask that Easton Tower remain separate from tonight's events." Arthur closed his eyes in visible shame. Cassandra looked at the attorney in disbelief. "You came here—" She struggled to finish the sentence. "To buy his silence?" No one answered. Malcolm slowly reached into his pocket and unfolded the broken yellow thread. He looked at the 3 tiny knots resting in his palm. Then he quietly closed his hand around them. The offer could change Nia's life, but somewhere deep inside, he already knew that accepting it would teach her the one lesson he never wanted his daughter to learn, that the truth had a price, and that enough money could make it disappear. Malcolm slowly closed his fingers around the broken yellow thread. For several seconds, no one spoke. The flashing lights from the fire trucks reflected across the wet pavement, washing every face in alternating shades of red and blue. Daniel Foster waited patiently. He had negotiated settlements for 20 years. Silence usually meant people were calculating. Malcolm wasn't calculating. He was remembering. Nia sitting at the kitchen table that morning, her careful little fingers tying 3 knots. "Promises count." Daniel finally spoke again. "The offer isn't intended as an insult, Mr. Reed." "No," Malcolm asked quietly. "It sounds like one." The attorney took a measured breath. "My client wants to prevent years of litigation." "My client wants families to be safe," Malcolm answered. "The 2 goals don't have to compete." Arthur Bell lowered his eyes. "They shouldn't," Cassandra looked from the attorney to her father. What report are you talking about? Arthur's voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent years carrying something heavier than age. After Easton Tower, Malcolm documented every design failure he found. He warned that the ventilation system could spread smoke instead of containing it. Rachel stared at Arthur. Then why wasn't it corrected? Arthur didn't answer immediately. When he finally did, every word sounded painful. Because correcting it meant admitting we had approved work that wasn't ready. The company would have lost investors. The project would have collapsed. And so, his voice faltered. Someone decided it would be easier to bury the report. Cassandra took an involuntary step backward. Who? Arthur looked directly at his daughter. I did. The words struck harder than any accusation. Rachel covered her mouth. Daniel closed his briefcase without another argument. There was no negotiating around a confession. Arthur continued quietly. I convinced myself I was protecting thousands of jobs. I told myself one compromise would save the company. But compromises have a way of demanding another one. He looked toward the hotel behind them. And another. Cassandra's eyes filled with disbelief. Easton Tower. And tonight, Arthur nodded. The ventilation consultant warned us both times. He was ignored both times. Malcolm spoke for the first time since the offer had been made. The warning wasn't ignored. It was heard. It just wasn't convenient. His words landed softly, which somehow made them impossible to dismiss. Rachel reached into her tablet and opened the Bell renewal project schedule. She scanned several engineering updates before suddenly stopping. There are inspection delays. Everyone looked at her. 2 senior housing buildings were scheduled for independent ventilation testing. They were postponed. She looked up slowly. Twice. Cassandra took the tablet. The approval signatures sat plainly on the screen. Executive authorization. Budget deferral. Inspection delayed pending occupancy schedule. Her own electronic signature appeared beneath both approvals. She remembered signing them. She hadn't read beyond the executive summary. She had trusted the process because it carried the Bell name. For the first time in years, she questioned whether the reputation she had spent her life protecting had become the very thing preventing people from telling her the truth. Arthur reached for her hand. You still have a chance. She looked at him. To do what? To finish what I should have done. Rain began falling lightly across the parking lot. Guests hurried toward waiting cars. Firefighters rolled hoses back onto their engines. The emergency itself was ending. Something much larger was only beginning. Cassandra turned toward Malcolm. If I reopen Easton Tower, the board may remove me. They might. The Bell renewal project could be delayed. It could. My father's legacy. Malcolm looked at the hotel behind them before answering. A legacy that needs people to stay silent isn't a legacy. He paused. It's a debt. The words settled over everyone standing there. No one argued, because every person present knew exactly who would have to decide whether that debt would finally be paid. 3 weeks later, the ballroom at Lakeshore Crown stood quiet. The chandeliers still shined. The marble floors still reflected the morning light, but the celebration banners were gone. In their place stood rows of reporters, engineers, city officials, and residents waiting to hear what Bell Urban Holdings intended to do next. Cassandra Bell walked to the podium without the polished confidence she had worn the night of the gala. This time, she carried a thick binder instead of a prepared speech. She looked toward the audience until her eyes found Malcolm Reed. He wasn't seated with executives. He sat beside hotel employees, firefighters, maintenance workers, and several elderly residents who had attended the fundraiser that night, exactly where he wanted to be. Cassandra opened the binder. Today, she began quietly, I am not announcing a new development. I am correcting an old failure. The room fell completely silent. She released the complete Easton Tower engineering report under Malcolm's original authorship. She publicly acknowledged that critical safety findings had been removed before the final version was archived. She announced her immediate leave of absence as CEO, while an independent review examined both Easton Tower and every Bell renewal property still awaiting occupancy. Then she said the words few expected to hear. My family's reputation cannot matter more than another family's safety. No applause followed, only thoughtful silence, because everyone understood what those words would cost. The independent engineering review began immediately. Within days, inspectors confirmed ventilation defects in 2 Bell Renewal buildings that had not yet opened. Construction stopped before a single resident moved inside. Hundreds of future tenants, many of them elderly couples and working families, would never know how close they had come to living inside unsafe buildings. That, Malcolm thought, was exactly how real safety should work. Quietly. Before tragedy ever had the chance to introduce itself. The Bell Urban Holdings Board voted to establish a permanent independent building safety council. When they offered Malcolm the position of executive director, he accepted only after adding one condition. Residents, hotel staff, maintenance workers, accessibility advocates. They all deserve voting seats, not advisory seats, real votes. The board hesitated, then approved every request. Weeks later, Lakeshore Crown reopened. The repaired east fire door now closed with one smooth, solid motion. Malcolm tested it once. It latched perfectly. Elliot Crane approached, stopping beside him. I owe you an apology. Malcolm looked over. I judged the uniform before the man wearing it. I was wrong. You admitted it. That matters, Elliot nodded. It won't happen again. Across the lobby, Rachel smiled as she watched new evacuation maps being installed throughout the hotel, not because regulations demanded them, because people finally understood why they mattered. That evening, Malcolm arrived home carrying a small paper bag from the neighborhood craft store. Nia sat at the kitchen table, finishing her homework. I found something, he said. She looked up. Inside the bag were bright yellow threads. She smiled immediately. You kept the old one? Malcolm carefully placed the 3 loose knots onto the table. I couldn't throw them away. Together, they tied a new cord around his old watch. 1 knot for Danielle, 1 for Malcolm, 1 for Nia. She paused before tying one final knot. What's this one for? Malcolm asked. Nia smiled as she tightened it carefully. For everyone who gets home because somebody cared enough to speak up. Malcolm looked at the 4 knots resting against his wrist. For the first time in many years, they didn't remind him of what had been taken away. They reminded him of what had been protected. A few days later, Malcolm returned to Lakeshore Crown for a weekend dinner shift. Not because he had to, because he wanted Nia to see something. She sat quietly in the corner reading while waiting for him to finish. Guests arrived wearing business suits, work boots, jeans, elegant dresses, and delivery uniforms. Malcolm greeted every one of them exactly the same. Good evening. We're glad you're here. Above the service station hung a new bronze plaque installed by the hotel staff themselves. It read, No one who walks through these doors is less important than anyone else. Nia looked at the plaque, then at the yellow thread around her father's watch. She smiled. Without another word, she reached over and took his hand. Outside, the repaired east fire door closed softly behind the last guest of the evening. Strong, quiet, exactly as it always should have. And Malcolm realized that the greatest legacy a person could leave behind was never a building, a company, or a family name. It was the courage to make sure the next person walked through the same door a little safer than before. When Nia tied that 4th yellow knot around Malcolm's old watch, it wasn't just a piece of thread anymore. It became a quiet reminder that one brave choice, made at the right moment, can protect people you'll never even meet. This story reminds us that a single moment of courage can change far more than one life. Malcolm didn't become extraordinary because he was fearless. He became extraordinary because he chose to act when staying silent would have been easier. The next time you notice something that doesn't feel right, don't ignore it just because everyone else does. Be the person who speaks up, just like Malcolm did, because you never know whose future might depend on your voice. If Malcolm's story stayed with you, leave a 1 in the comments. And tell me this. Have you ever made a difficult choice because you knew it was the right thing to do, even if it came with a cost? I'd truly love to read your story. Thank you for spending this time with us today. Stay close, because the next story will remind us once again that the strongest people are often the ones the world overlooks first.